Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be beginning our discussion on queer Americans by talking about Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Stonewall. And we're going to be talking about how being queer in America has affected people's political opportunities. So I just want to start with a quick do now. Are human rights movements inspired by certain individuals or by certain events? Do you think movements have specific starts and ends? So just take a second to think about that question. Okay. So are human rights movements inspired by certain individuals or by certain events? Personally, I think it's a blend of both. Movements will have inspiring leaders, but they'll also have inspiring events, as we'll see in the slideshow. And I think the perfect blend of both can really start a movement that's lasting and that makes real change. I don't think movements have specific starts and ends, though. I think they tend to blend. Um, and you'll see in time periods there are many activists who work in different movements at different times. Um, so one example I can think of is Bayard Rustin. He worked in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and actually he planned the March on Washington. And then during the 70s and 80s, he transitioned into working into working for the gay rights movement. So people tend to just move between movements and work at different movements at different times that are all ultimately working for the same goal of human rights and civil rights for everyone. So I want to begin our discussion by talking about Marsha P. Johnson. She's pictured here on the right. She was a black and transgender activist for LGBTQ plus rights. She was born August  24th, 1945, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. She moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, famous for being the center of gay life in New York City. There, she discovered herself and found joy as a drag queen, and she also worked as a prostitute to support herself. She was a drag mother who took care of homeless LGBTQ plus youth, and she died on July 6th, 1992. Another person I want to talk to you about is Sylvia Rivera, and she's pictured here on the right as well. She was a Latina and transgender activist for LGBTQ plus rights. She was born July 2nd, 1951 in the Bronx and raised by her grandmother, and she ran away at age 11 after being beaten for being gay. She became a child prostitute in Times Square, where she met a group of drag queens who took her under their wing, and she was involved in the early gay rights movement. She left when white cisgender gay men and lesbian feminists shoved queer people of color out of the movement. Cisgender means someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. So, if the doctor said that they were female at birth and they identify as female, they're cisgender. She rejoined the movement later on to fight for transgender rights, along with Marsha P. Johnson, and she died of liver cancer on February 19th, 2002. So, I want to talk to you about the pre-Stonewall US. Queer people had very few civil rights during this time period, so pre-1969. Groups such as the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis had picket lines and conferences to advocate for change, but that change was very slow and it was very limited. Many gay people socialized at gay bars, many of which were underground, and especially in New York, they were owned by the mafia. Bars were raided frequently by police, and owners would have to pay them off to reopen. Um, one such bar, one such mafia-owned bar, was the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street, which was in Greenwich Village, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a center of gay life in the 1960s in New York City. So, on Saturday, June 28th, 1969, there was a surprise raid on the Stonewall Inn. The police rounded up those inside and began putting them into paddy wagons, and a crowd slowly gathered outside the bar and began throwing pennies at the police, which were symbolic of the bribes that the police took. One person, suspected to be Marsha P. Johnson, threw a brick at the police, and a full blown riot broke out. Sylvia Rivera was also suspected to be there because the night was so violent and chaotic. There aren't a lot of accurate accounts, and we don't really know who was there. But it's believed that she was there, and it's believed that she threw the first Molotov cocktail at the police. The bar was soon set on fire, and the crowd dispersed. But the next day, there were more protests, making Stonewall one of the most visible beginnings of the modern LGBTQ plus rights movement. And on the right here, you can see a bunch of people fighting and waving banners that are pro queer. So, um, on the right here, you can see Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. And in 1970, they founded Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, because they were fed up with the constant pushing aside of transgender people and transgender people of color, especially in the gay rights movement. So, their goal was to take care of queer youth living on the streets, and they founded Star House, a building they bought and funded by doing sex work. Through Star House, they housed and educated queer kids living on the street and provided them with a stable home, sometimes for the first time in their lives. And it was the first shelter for LGBTQ plus kids in the United States. I want to finish off with a quick exit slip. Why do you think Stonewall became a riot? Why did that spark a movement? Does infighting hurt or help a movement? So just pause the video right here and take a second to reflect on this. Okay. So personally, I think Stonewall became a riot because of the historical events surrounding that specific raid. There had actually been another raid a couple days prior. Um, and I guess the fact that raids were spaced out made it easier to tolerate, but two raids in such a short amount of time infuriated people, and it was just the right combination of people at the right place and right time that led to a riot happening. And I think that sparked a movement because it really showed that queer people could fight back and they could do so successfully. And um, it just led to, and because it was so visible, it was able to lead to a widespread movement, especially because queer people were beginning to fight for the rights at around the same time. So this really galvanized them. And infighting really hurts a movement because, as we've seen, infighting leads to a lot of people who could otherwise be beneficial to the movement leaving it, and that weakens a movement. And it also makes it easier to attack because if you point at a movement and say, oh, they're fighting all the time, then it's harder for people to support when they're first starting to try and find an organization or a movement to support. So thank you once again for joining me. As usual, I'll be linking the primary source document in the description. And I hope you have a wonderful day.